Officer Stevens was finishing up his shift when he saw a car roll through a stop sign. It wasn't anything unusual, but Stevens was in a bad mood. He had been dealing with complaints all day, and now this simple traffic violation seemed to be the last straw. With a sigh, he flipped on the siren and pulled the car over. The car slowly came to a stop, and Stevens stepped out of his patrol car. He was used to this routine by now, and as usual, he walked to the driver's side of the car with a stern expression. He was expecting the typical story. A driver who didn't want to admit they made a mistake. Someone trying to get out of a ticket. But as Stevens looked inside the car, he immediately noticed something different. The driver, a black woman, was calm, almost too calm. She was sitting straight in her seat, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. There was no sign of panic, no nervous glances. Instead, she just looked collected. Stevens felt an odd twinge in his stomach. Normally, drivers would get flustered when he approached, maybe even try to argue or beg their way out of a fine. But not this woman. She wasn't scared. She wasn't anxious. It made him feel uneasy. He stood there for a moment staring at her, wondering if she was hiding something. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "Yes, I went through a stop sign," the woman replied calmly, her voice steady. She wasn't looking at him yet. She seemed to be focusing on something in the distance, as though the interaction didn't concern her. Stevens wasn't sure how to react. Most drivers would already be apologizing or explaining themselves. But this woman's cool demeanor didn't sit right with him. It was as though she didn't care about the traffic violation, like she had other things on her mind. He asked for her license and registration, and she handed them over without hesitation, still not making eye contact. Stevens took the documents and went back to his patrol car to run a check. Something about the woman's calmness continued to nag at him. Maybe it was the way she seemed unaffected by the situation or the way she sat so still. He kept replaying her steady voice in his head. There was something different about her, something that made him feel like he was the one being judged. When Stevens returned to her car, he was already feeling the pressure of the encounter. He handed her back the documents and explained the ticket. The woman nodded politely, still not showing any sign of agitation. But Stevens was starting to feel frustrated. Why wasn't she reacting the way he expected? Why wasn't she apologizing or protesting? "Is everything okay, officer?" she asked, her voice still calm. Stevens felt a surge of irritation. Of course, everything wasn't okay. He had been dealing with difficult people all day, and now here was this woman, acting like she was above it all. "I'm fine," he snapped, his tone harsher than he intended. The woman's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch or shrink back. She just looked at him, waiting for him to continue. The calmness she projected was starting to feel like a challenge to him, as if she were questioning his authority without saying a word. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had the power to write her a ticket, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Something about the situation was off, and his usual sense of control was slipping. She hadn't done anything wrong, but her coolness was starting to feel like a challenge. He was beginning to question why this encounter was bothering him so much. Stevens's thoughts were interrupted when the woman spoke again, her tone still polite but now carrying a hint of curiosity. "I don't mean to rush you, but I'm on my way to an important meeting," she said. "I have to get going soon." The statement was simple, but it struck Stevens. She had somewhere to be. The thought made him feel like he was wasting her time. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the long day had gotten to him. But he wasn't about to let her get away without a ticket. "All right, I'll write you up," he said, trying to regain some sense of control. The woman didn't argue. She just nodded, thanked him, and patiently waited for him to finish writing the ticket. Her lack of reaction was starting to frustrate him even more, but he couldn't figure out why. Was she dismissing him? Was she showing him a lack of respect? As Stevens walked back to his patrol car to finish the paperwork, he glanced back at her car. She was still sitting there, her hands resting on the wheel, looking straight ahead. There was no sense of urgency, no sign of anger or frustration. She was simply waiting. Stevens couldn't help but feel like he had just met someone who was completely out of his league. This wasn't the usual traffic stop. This woman wasn't the type to be intimidated by his badge or his uniform. And that thought, more than anything else, left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. Little did Stevens know, this encounter wasn't going to end like any other. The woman he had just pulled over wasn't just an ordinary driver. She was someone with far more power than he could ever imagine. And that realization would come sooner than he expected. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Stevens returned to his patrol car, still stewing over the encounter. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly as he prepared the ticket. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had lingered since he first approached the car. Everything about this traffic stop felt different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the woman's car, still parked behind him. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't getting impatient. She was just sitting there waiting. There was something almost unnerving about how composed she was. It wasn't that she was calm. It was the way she held herself. She seemed completely unaffected by the fact that she had just been pulled over by a police officer. In his experience, most people were either nervous, defensive, or trying to find ways to talk their way out of a ticket. But this woman? She wasn't trying to do anything. She was simply waiting. Stevens finished writing the ticket and walked back to her car, his boots tapping on the pavement with each step. His mind was still running in circles, replaying their conversation. Why had she stayed so calm, and why had he felt so rattled? He couldn't quite pinpoint why her lack of reaction bothered him so much, but there was no denying the feeling of discomfort that had settled in his chest. As he reached the car, he noticed the woman hadn't looked up. Her gaze was still fixed forward, like she was either lost in thought or simply uninterested in him. Stevens cleared his throat before tapping on the window. The woman slowly turned her head and met his eyes for the first time. Her gaze was calm, composed, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet strength, a sense of self-assuredness that was hard to ignore. He held out the ticket for her to sign, but she didn't immediately take it. Instead, she studied his face for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't understand," she said, her voice still level but tinged with a hint of curiosity. "Why are you doing this?" It was a simple mistake. I admitted it. Stevens, caught off guard, felt a wave of irritation wash over him. "It's my job," he snapped, handing her the ticket more forcefully than necessary. "I don't make the rules." The woman took the ticket without a word. Her fingers brushed against his as she signed, her touch light, almost delicate. As she handed it back to him, she spoke again. "I wasn't trying to disrespect you, officer, but I'm just trying to get to a meeting. I think we both have better things to do than stand here." Stevens didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to argue, to get defensive, but he knew it would only escalate things further. He had already allowed his frustration to take over, and now he just wanted this encounter to be over. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back from her car. "You're free to go." As the woman drove away, Stevens watched her go, still feeling that same unsettling feeling. Something about her, the way she carried herself, lingered in his mind long after she was gone. He was used to the usual interactions, drivers who were either frightened or angry, trying to defend themselves or plead their case. But she hadn't done any of that. She hadn't played into his expectations. It was as if she had already figured out what kind of officer he was, what kind of situation he was trying to create, and she didn't need to respond to it. Stevens knew that was part of what bothered him the most. He had no control over her, no ability to provoke a reaction, and that made him feel powerless in a way he had never felt before. This woman had stripped away his authority without even trying. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just her calmness that unsettled him. It was her ability to stay completely composed, to remain unaffected by his authority. But what Stevens didn't know, as he sat back in his patrol car and drove off, was that the woman he had just pulled over was no ordinary driver. Her composure, her confidence, it wasn't just a reaction to the traffic stop. It was a reflection of who she was. And she was about to turn his world upside down. As Stevens made his way through the city, his mind racing, the last thing he expected was to find out that the woman he had just written a ticket to was about to become his superior, his boss. What he had mistaken for indifference was, in reality, a deeper understanding of her position. She wasn't just a black woman driving through the city. She was the new chief of police. And Stevens was about to find out that his actions would have consequences far beyond this simple traffic stop. Officer Stevens had never been one to back down from a situation, no matter how tense. But something about his encounter with the woman, now revealed to be the new chief of police, left him feeling off balance in a way he couldn't ignore. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became with himself. How had he let a simple traffic stop get under his skin like that? She wasn't the first person to be uncooperative or unflappable, yet this time, it had shaken him to his core. Back at the precinct, Stevens found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting to the woman, the chief. He replayed the way she had remained calm, unaffected even when he had tried to assert his authority. In the back of his mind, a growing realization began to dawn on him. He had made a terrible mistake. He hadn't just pulled over an ordinary citizen. He hadn't just ticketed someone who could forget about this encounter in a few days. He had crossed a line with someone who held immense power, someone who could change his career with a single decision. As the shift came to a close, Stevens could feel the weight of what had happened weighing heavily on him. His phone buzzed as he packed his things and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his captain, instructing him to report to the precinct early the next morning. "Report to the chief's office," it read. Stevens' stomach churned. He knew that the chief was a no-nonsense kind of person. He had heard about her before, seen her rise quickly through the ranks, and everyone in the department spoke highly of her leadership. But there was no way he could have known that the woman he had pulled over earlier that day was her. There had been no indication, no clue that she was more than just an ordinary driver. Now, the thought of facing her was almost unbearable. The next morning, Stevens walked into the precinct, the uneasy feeling from the previous day still lingering in his chest. He had no idea what to expect when he stepped into the chief's office. He wasn't sure if she would be angry, disappointed, or simply cold and professional. What he did know, however, was that he was going to have to face the consequences of his actions. He arrived at the office, and as soon as he entered, he saw her sitting behind the desk. The chief was as calm and collected as she had been when they first met. Nothing about her demeanor seemed out of place. But Stevens could feel the tension in the air, an invisible force that seemed to wrap itself around him. She gestured for him to sit, and Stevens took a seat across from her, trying to steady his nerves. "You probably know why you're here," the chief said, her voice smooth and even, with just a hint of authority. "I've seen the report, Stevens." Stevens nodded, his throat dry. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of sitting across from the very woman he had disrespected the day before. "I want you to understand something, officer," she continued. "I'm not here to punish you for doing your job. I'm here to make sure you understand why what happened yesterday can't happen again. That was not a routine traffic stop. And you didn't just disrespect a citizen, you disrespected your own department and you disrespected me." Stevens swallowed hard, the words stinging more than he expected. He had always prided himself on being professional, on following the rules, on enforcing the law. But he had let his emotions get the best of him, and now the consequences were clear. The chief leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "What I saw yesterday wasn't just an officer doing his duty. It was an officer who let his biases and frustrations cloud his judgment. You let a simple mistake, a traffic violation, turn into something much bigger. And that's not how we operate in this department." Stevens shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. He had heard about her leadership style, direct, no nonsense, and always fair, but hearing it firsthand was something entirely different. She wasn't raising her voice or showing anger, but her presence was commanding. He felt as though every word she spoke was cutting right to the heart of the matter. "I didn't know it was you, ma'am," Stevens said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I didn't recognize you. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize who you were. If I had known," the chief held up a hand, silencing him. "It doesn't matter who I am. It shouldn't have mattered. What matters is that you made a choice to escalate the situation, rather than de-escalate it. You allowed your authority to become an obstacle, rather than a tool for maintaining order. I could have been anyone. The fact that I was your superior doesn't change that you still need to treat everyone with respect." Stevens felt his face flush. He was embarrassed, more embarrassed than he had ever been in his career. He had messed up and now he was facing the consequences. But it wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about the trust he had broken, the professionalism he had lost in the heat of the moment. "Are you going to fire me?" Stevens asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke. "No, she said, her tone steady. But this is a wake-up call. You need to do some self-reflection. You need to understand that the badge you wear means more than just enforcing the law. It's about leadership, integrity, and respect. And right now you're not showing that. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. Stevens felt a mixture of shame and determination swelling inside him. He wasn't the kind of officer who would let this define him, but he knew he had a long road ahead to earn back the trust he had lost. I want you to report to diversity and sensitivity training, the chief said, her voice firm but not unkind. And I want you to think long and hard about the kind of officer you want to be. If you want to stay in this department, you'll need to show me that you can learn from this mistake. Stevens nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He knew this was his chance to prove himself, to make things right. But it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. However, Stevens was determined to do the work, to fix what he had broken, and maybe, just maybe, he could emerge as a better officer for it. The morning after his tense meeting with the chief, Officer Stevens was still reeling from the weight of her words. He had spent the entire night reflecting on the situation, replaying every moment of that traffic stop, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong, but he couldn't escape the undeniable truth. He had let his anger and frustration cloud his judgment. The chief hadn't just reprimanded him. She had made it clear that this wasn't about a single mistake. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change, and Stevens knew, deep down, that this was a pivotal moment in his career. The consequences of his actions had just begun to unfold, and it wasn't going to be easy to undo the damage he had caused. Stevens arrived at the precinct early the next morning, feeling the weight of responsibility hanging over him. His mind raced with thoughts of the chief and what she had said about self-reflection. He didn't want to let her down, but the truth was he didn't know if he was capable of truly changing. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who did his duty. But now, for the first time, he was questioning whether he had ever really understood what it meant to be a good officer. His first stop was the training room, where a new course on diversity, equity, and sensitivity was being held. Stevens had always seen these kinds of programs as a formality, something officers had to do to check a box. But now, standing in front of the door, he wasn't so sure. The words self-reflection and bias were more than just concepts to him now. They were real, raw issues that he had never fully grappled with. He couldn't ignore the fact that his actions had been driven by something deep inside him, something he had never truly confronted before. And now, it was time to face that head-on. As he walked into the training room, Stevens noticed a few other officers already seated. They were chatting among themselves, some laughing, some clearly uninterested in the session. But Stevens took a seat in the back, his posture rigid, his mind focused. He had no idea how this would go, but he was determined to take it seriously. For the first time in his career, he understood the weight of his actions beyond just the immediate consequences. It wasn't just about the ticket he had written or the way he had treated the woman. This was about the ingrained biases and assumptions that had shaped his behavior over the years. The instructor, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, stood at the front of the room. She introduced herself as Dr. Martin, a psychologist who specialized in helping law enforcement officers navigate difficult topics like racial bias and systemic inequality. Stevens had expected a lecture, something dry and academic. But what he got was far more engaging. Dr. Martin didn't just talk at them. She challenged them. She asked them to think about the way they saw the world, the assumptions they made about people based on their appearance, their behavior, or their background. She asked them to confront their own biases, even the ones they didn't know they had. At first, Stevens felt defensive. He wasn't a racist, he told himself. He had always treated people with respect, regardless of their race or background. But as Dr. Martin guided them through various exercises, he began to realize that his actions had been influenced by more than just his training. He had been conditioned by society, by the media, by the very system he had sworn to protect. He had allowed his personal frustrations to shape his interactions with others. And in doing so, he had created an environment where people like the woman in the traffic stop could be treated as less than human. As the day wore on, Stevens began to see things from a different perspective. He was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, about the way he had operated for years without questioning his actions. He realized that being a good cop wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the complex dynamics of power, race, and authority. It was about recognizing his own privilege and the way it shaped the way he interacted with others. The chief had been right. He had let his authority get in the way of doing his job properly. He had let his ego take over, and now he was paying the price. By the end of the day, Stevens felt exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had learned more in those few hours than he had in years of training. He had been forced to take a hard look at himself, at his biases, and at the way he had treated others. It was a humbling experience, one that left him feeling both guilty and hopeful. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. He could become the officer the chief had always hoped he would be. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and a willingness to keep pushing himself even when it was uncomfortable. But Stevens was ready to do the work. That night, as he sat in his apartment, Stevens thought back to the chief. He thought about the way she had looked at him during their meeting, the calm authority in her voice. He had been so focused on his own ego, his own sense of control, that he hadn't seen her for what she truly was, someone who understood the deeper issues at play. She wasn't just a boss. She was a leader, someone who had risen to the top by confronting her own biases, by doing the hard work that most people wouldn't. Stevens realized that he had a long way to go before he could even begin to live up to her example. But for the first time, he felt like he had the tools to do it. The next morning, as Stevens reported back for duty, he felt a new sense of resolve. He knew that he still had a lot to learn, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to do everything in his power to make things right. And this time, he wasn't going to let his authority define him. He was going to let his integrity guide him instead. The days following Officer Stevens' diversity training were some of the most difficult of his career. Every moment he spent on patrol felt like a reminder of the mistakes he had made, and the work that still lay ahead. The weight of his encounter with the chief was never far from his mind. He couldn't shake the image of her calm, unwavering gaze as she had laid out the truth. He needed to do better, and he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. His ego had gotten in the way, and now he had to rebuild the trust he had lost, not just with the chief, but with himself. It wasn't long before Stevens began to notice a shift in his own perspective. During interactions with civilians, he found himself paying more attention to the way he approached people. Gone were the days of simply assuming everyone would react to him in the same way. Now every encounter felt like an opportunity to challenge his old assumptions, to dig deeper into the underlying causes of his behavior. He started making small changes, more time spent listening, more effort spent understanding the frustrations of those he interacted with, rather than just focusing on his role as an enforcer of rules. But the real test came when the chief made a public statement about the incident. The media had picked up on the story of the officer who had struck the woman, unaware of her true identity. The backlash was swift and severe. Social media was flooded with criticism. Protests were organized, and calls for accountability echoed through the streets. It was clear that the chief had made a statement not just about Stevens' behavior, but about the department's commitment to addressing racial inequality in law enforcement. Stevens found himself caught in the crossfire. He wasn't just the officer in the wrong. He had become the symbol of everything that was wrong with the police force, a reminder of the deep-rooted biases that still infected the system. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, and the shame lingered like a cloud over his every action. He had hoped that the training and the chief's scolding would be enough to set things right, but now he realized that the work he had to do went beyond just internal reflection. He had to prove himself not just to the chief, but to everyone who had witnessed his mistake. It wasn't easy. Stevens faced questions from his colleagues, some of whom were supportive, others less so. Some saw his actions as a failure of character, while others argued that it was a simple mistake, an unfortunate situation exacerbated by stress and the pressures of the job. But Stevens knew better. He knew it was more than just a mistake. It was a manifestation of the unconscious biases that had shaped his career for years, and those couldn't be fixed overnight. He would have to put in the work every single day. The real turning point came when he was assigned to a community outreach program. The chief had decided that Stevens, as a way of earning back trust, would be involved in bridging the gap between the police force and the communities they served. It was a bold move, one that felt like both a punishment and an opportunity for redemption. Stevens would have to engage with residents in some of the neighborhoods most affected by the police force's negative reputation. These were the same neighborhoods that had been protesting, the ones that had felt the brunt of the systemic racism and inequality within the department. Now Stevens had to face those people directly. The first few visits were a struggle. People weren't interested in hearing his excuses or his "I'm changing" speeches. The residents weren't eager to trust him or any officer who walked through their doors. Stevens found himself facing angry parents, frustrated business owners, and disillusioned community leaders. Many of them had seen too much, experienced too many instances of injustice to give him the benefit of the doubt. At first, Stevens tried to play it safe. He stuck to what he knew, offering generic responses and assurances that he would work on doing better. But time and again, the community members pushed back. They wanted more than just promises. They wanted action. They wanted to see that the police and the officers within it weren't just out for themselves. They wanted to know that they could trust him, that he wasn't just another officer who saw them as the other. It was during one of these community meetings, in a small church basement filled with skeptical faces, that Stevens had his breakthrough. A woman in the front row, a mother of 2 young boys, stood up and spoke directly to him. She didn't mince words. "You don't get to just walk in here and tell us you're sorry," she said. "You don't get to just make everything go away with an apology. What are you going to do to make sure your colleagues don't do the same thing? What are you going to do to stop this from happening again?" Stevens felt the sting of her words, but they were exactly what he needed to hear. He had been focused on his own redemption, on trying to fix his own mistakes, but the truth was, this wasn't just about him. It was about a system, a culture, that had failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. It was about the daily struggles of the people in this community, people who had been unjustly treated by officers like him for far too long. "I'm not here to apologize again," Stevens said, his voice steady. "I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do the work. But I need your help. I need to know what I can do to make things better. I can't do this alone. I can't just walk in and expect everything to change with one conversation. I know I have a lot to prove, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The room fell silent. Stevens could feel the weight of their stares, their skepticism. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was being judged just for his past mistakes. He felt like he was being given a chance. And that was all he needed. The next few weeks were hard. The work didn't get easier and the skepticism didn't disappear. But Stevens kept showing up. He kept engaging with the community, attending meetings, and having uncomfortable conversations. He kept making an effort to listen more than he spoke, to understand rather than defend himself. Slowly, the walls began to come down. Stevens didn't expect to be forgiven overnight, and he didn't expect the community to trust him without question. But he began to see the change little by little. People started sharing their stories with him. They started seeing that he was serious about making things right, that he wasn't just fulfilling a mandate from the chief, but that he genuinely wanted to change the way he interacted with the world. The road ahead was still long, but Stevens knew that he was on the right path. The chief had warned him that it would take time to rebuild what he had lost, but now, he understood that it wasn't just about rebuilding trust. It was about being the kind of officer who worked every day to prevent the mistakes of the past from repeating. The real work had just begun. As weeks passed, Stevens began to see that the road to redemption was far from straightforward. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and attend community outreach meetings. The public backlash had not faded away, and the scrutiny on him remained high. The community's perception of him was still colored by his actions, and many were still skeptical about his sincerity. The weight of being a public figure who had failed the very people he was sworn to protect pressed down on him daily. The media hadn't let the story die. Every now and then, news outlets would run follow-up pieces on the incident, still discussing the officer who had lost his cool with the woman, unaware that she was his boss. His face had become synonymous with a larger conversation about police brutality, racial injustice, and systemic problems in law enforcement. People would recognize him on the street not as Officer Stevens, but as the officer who hit the woman. That label clung to him like a shadow, no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. What bothered Stevens the most was that he had made a huge mistake, but he hadn't known it at the time. Now that he could see the full scope of his actions, he realized that this was a moment that would shape his career for better or for worse. He had the chance to turn things around, to not just be an officer who got caught in a scandal, but someone who actively worked to undo the harm he'd caused. It wasn't until he began to spend more time with the chief and see her in action that he understood the weight of her leadership. She wasn't just a symbol of authority or a figurehead. She was someone who had fought for change, someone who had broken through barriers that were meant to keep people like her from rising to the top. The chief had faced her own share of adversity to get to where she was, and now it was clear to Stevens that she wasn't just there to command the police force. She was there to lead it toward a new future, one where accountability and respect were at the forefront. One of the most humbling moments came during a department-wide meeting when the chief stood in front of her officers and spoke openly about the incident involving Stevens. She didn't shy away from the truth, nor did she sugarcoat it. Instead, she acknowledged the systemic issues at play and made it clear that the department had to change. But she also made a point of saying that the focus shouldn't solely be on what Stevens had done wrong. It should be on how the entire force was going to move forward. For the first time, Stevens felt like he wasn't being singled out or demonized. He was part of something bigger than himself, and the responsibility now lay on everyone in the room. Her words struck him deeply. She had the rare ability to bring people together, to hold them accountable while also offering them a path forward. It wasn't just about punishing mistakes. It was about fostering an environment where officers could learn, grow, and improve. It was about building trust from the ground up. And Stevens realized that if he was truly going to be part of that change, he needed to embrace that same approach in his own life. The chief had decided that Stevens would serve as a representative in an initiative she was launching aimed at improving police-community relations. It was a bold move, one that could backfire if he didn't prove himself. But Stevens knew that this was his chance to truly show his commitment to change. He wasn't just going to attend meetings, he was going to be part of the solution. He was assigned to work directly with community leaders, activists, and civilians who had long been critical of the police force. This wasn't a PR exercise, it was real hard work. And Stevens had to earn his place at the table. The first few meetings were tense. The people he met with weren't interested in hearing about his struggles or his journey to redemption. They had been victims of a system that had ignored their pain for far too long. But Stevens didn't back down. He listened. He acknowledged their frustrations without offering excuses. He asked questions, sometimes uncomfortable ones, about how the police could do better, about what needed to change on the ground. Gradually, his approach began to shift the dynamic. People began to see that he wasn't there just to placate them. He was there to listen and to act. He worked alongside them to identify concrete steps that could be taken to rebuild trust between the police and the community. They started to talk about things like better training for officers, community patrols, and increased transparency within the department. It was a slow process, but Stevens could see the change happening. He could feel it in the way people began to engage with him more openly, in the way their tone softened when they spoke. But the real breakthrough came when Stevens was invited to participate in a town hall meeting. The event was being held in a neighborhood that had been at the center of many protests against police brutality. The community was angry, and there was a palpable sense of distrust hanging in the air. Stevens was nervous. This wasn't just another meeting. It was a public forum where he would have to answer tough questions in front of a crowd that had every right to question his integrity. As he stood at the podium, listening to one of the residents ask him why the police had failed to protect their community, Stevens felt his throat tighten. This wasn't about defending himself or trying to justify the mistakes of the past. This was about taking responsibility for a system that had hurt people for generations. And for the first time in his life, Stevens wasn't just an officer in the middle of a crisis. He was a human being, standing before a group of people who had every right to demand better from him and from the department he represented. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm here to listen, and I'm here to help make things better. I know I've made mistakes and I know I've hurt people, but I promise you that I will do everything I can to fix it." There was a long silence after his words, and Stevens braced himself for the backlash. But instead, something unexpected happened. A man in the crowd stood up and nodded. He didn't say anything, but his body language softened. Then another person stood, and another until the room was filled with people who were at least willing to hear him out. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. And for Stevens, that was more than he had hoped for. In the following weeks, he continued to be involved in these meetings, slowly but surely gaining the trust of the community. Every small win felt like a step toward redemption. And while he knew the journey was far from over, Stevens was beginning to believe that it was possible to rebuild what had been broken, not just in his career, but in the very system he had once been a part of. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was an agent of change, committed to proving that he could do better. It was a long road ahead, but Stevens was no longer afraid of the challenge. He knew that he had a responsibility not just to the chief, but to the people he had once failed, and he was willing to face whatever it took to make things right.